Indeed, political parties are racing towards INEC's deadline for the conduct of primaries to select candidates that would represent the parties during the 2023 general elections. Now, I'm sure that you noted that most of the headlines had APC, PDP in mind games as the elections, the conventions for both parties approach, which is supposed to be towards the end of this month and maybe the first 2 days in the month of June. We're watching events as they go on. Delegates hold the power to this. There's been some elections conducted for delegates in most of the political parties. How will things pan out? That's the thrust of our conversation this morning, which we'll be having with Mr. Nwankwo, who's Executive Director, Policy and Legal Advocacy Center. You're welcome to Sunrise Edit this morning.
Thank you, Margaret.
Well, I'm sure that you've been watching events, but just as the convention is approaching, we've seen we've seen also the humongous cost of forms. I'm sure that we're over that now. We've seen how many candidates have emerged. We've also seen the EFCC saying that they would like to, they would like to speak to INEC over the requesting information on the candidates. Maybe it's over the cost of forms. I don't know. But do you have any hope that we could see anything tangible come out of this conversation that EFCC will have at INEC?
Well, I think for INEC and EFCC on the cost of forms, I don't see the connection, because the forms or the cost of it or the payments have been made to the political parties. Certainly, you will have people who are interested in contesting for office. A lot of us are worried that you have started by disenfranchising the poor, or people who can't afford so much, and that for us is a concern and conversation with the political parties. I think that the conversation with INEC and EFCC, and that's also been a concern for civil society, is compliance with the limits of campaign funding for candidates and political parties. The Electoral Act is quite clear in stating how much a candidate can spend. Unfortunately, there seems to be a conversation around whether it also captures aspirants. But the truth is that when you have so much money being spent even to qualify to seek for that office, then you have started eliminating a huge percentage of your population. So a lot of people want to run for office. They look at the prescription about forms and how much to be paid, and they maybe are not able to muster that kind of funding. And some of these candidates or some of these aspirants or pre-aspirants are actually some of the best that you can have in those positions. So I think for a lot of us it's quite worrying. But I think, yes, the EFCC is right in seeking to work out an arrangement. And I think this is an arrangement that should also be worked out with different stakeholders. How do you keep tab on campaign funding? And how do you ensure, first of all, that you do not have illicit funds go into campaigns and buy up the votes, rather than people or candidates seeking to win the votes by convincing people about what they can do? And I think that's been the major reason a lot of us are concerned about the extent that politicians spend money on. There's also the concern about the turnover that you see with politicians who are holding elective office, sitting in that elective office, taking public funds and putting into campaigns. And that's why you go to the conversation around Section 8412, which talked about ensuring that people holding political offices resign before a certain time, because you don't want people sitting in a position of advantage, sitting in a position of access to public funds, and putting that into campaign and running elections. This is in addition to the fact that, of course, their primary responsibility of fulfilling the purpose of their appointment is defeated. A situation where you had so many ministers, director generals of government agencies buying forms and going into seeking to be candidates was quite worrying for a lot of us, and that was why we're quite pleased to see the president, even if it was done late, asking those in those offices to resign if they wanted to seek office.
Well, so, I mean, there's so many conversations to have from your opening statement. I see so many lines to strain from it. But let me follow this particular line. We've seen an uptick in the activities of the EFCC as the conventions draw near. Even though a lot of them are not mainstream politicians, we saw the arrest of the Accountant General of the Federation over an alleged 80 billion naira fraud. We've seen the arrest of former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Patricia Ete. We've also seen the arrest of Nsima Ekere, who is the former MD of the NDDC. We do not know whether there will be any further arrests. The EFCC has not exactly come to, clarify this arrest, but we imagine that it is as a result of investigation that has been ongoing. Do you think that this recent uptick in the activities of the EFCC and maybe leading up to the convention could have any effect on the spending of politicians? Do you think you'll be careful?
Well, I think always the point is made. If you are if you have access to public funds, if you have access to the budget of the Federation in whatever capacity, then there is a concern about use of it. I refuse at this time to make a connection between what the EFCC is doing and the politics of it. It would seem to me that even given the persons involved, this would be a routine EFCC activity, and so I don't want to go there. But again, I understand your point that it is important for agencies of government to be non-partisan, because for us who are observing the elections, who are watching the election process, we're also concerned that agencies of government don't become active to the detriment of persons for political reasons. But clearly, I don't want to make any linkage between these three arrests that you have mentioned and politics at this time.
You've talked about how INEC and EFCC could collaborate in terms of campaign spending, and you've raised the question as to whether or not what aspirants pay or what they spend in terms of whether it is captured or it is because the Electoral Act clearly says candidate, whether that would also be captured. Do you think that when eventually, one of the aspirants become candidates, there are so many of them jostling for different positions, would that person's, accounts now also capture what he or she spent as an aspirant, including purchase of forms, for instance?
I think that's the tricky part, and that's why we have advocated for some monitoring of campaign finances, and that was part of the rule defined in the bill, which is still sitting in the National Assembly on the Electoral Offences Commission, because INEC has repeatedly said that it is unable to carry out that aspect of its functions as defined in the Electoral Act or apprehend persons on account of that. And it's understandable. You need an independent agency to be able to do that, and that's why the advocacy for the Electoral Offences Commission has been on. It's tricky for INEC to begin to, if somebody becomes a candidate, it becomes tricky for you to begin to get into those conversations unless you have some independent verification of it. You have civil society organizations ask questions and so on.
So even the exercise by itself, the entire exercise of determining how much a candidate spent is almost an exercise in impossibility.
Well, you'd have to compile, you'd have to have evidence, and being a lawyer, I think it requires a lot more than speculation. So you have to have some dedicated monitoring, compilation of evidence, and presenting this to the prosecuting authorities. But again,
well, even in compiling it, do you think that it will? I don't think anyone ever thought that the cost of forms was going to be this high. Should it include the cost of forms? That's what I'm asking.
I should think so. But again, the law is very uncertain with respect to this, and you would need to argue to be able to capture this. But again, it doesn't take away the fact that everyone is quite embarrassed by the huge sums of money that aspirants have been asked to pay, and the flippancy that you have seen people produce these monies. I think for a lot of people who are going through incredible, harsh economic conditions in this country, it's quite a shock to see political parties make these requests. And it doesn't matter whether it's 100 million or 50 million or whatever. The point is that these are huge sums of money, and aspirants, people who don't necessarily have that kind of money but who want to enter into elective office, should be able to do so without being barred by the excessive nomination fees or expression of interest fees that the parties have imposed.
Let me flip this conversation now to my colleagues in Lagos. Ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you, Nwankwo. Mr. Nwankwo, let me begin by asking, because it sounds to me like you're saying that the law is weak in some areas. The lines are not clearly drawn in certain regards concerning this funding of elections. Because just as you're talking about, campaign funding, that is the party's spending that the law captures, not that of the candidates themselves. And the delegates are going to select the candidates, so there is that spending. Just yesterday, the media was awash with people who say this is the economy for delegates, and a lot of money is believed to move around in that time. If the law doesn't capture that, and the law does not capture the people, the different groups buying forms for aspirants in the different political parties, is that to say that the law is weak, or the lines are not drawn clearly concerning election funding in our country?
I think the laws are in a lot of ways very clear. First of all, it's not, the parties of course have the limits to which they can spend, but also the Electoral Act includes provisions that indicate how much an individual can contribute to a campaign. And I think that you then have to see how all of this is enforced. And I think that part of the problem is that there is no tracking of this, there is no agency, and going back again to the Electoral Offences Commission, which would be well placed if it was already established. You don't have an agency dealing with all of these issues, and I think it's a major concern for all of us how much is being spent and how much is being put forward to be spent. But again, it also becomes really delicate as you move to aspirants becoming candidates, because there is really no independent agency working on this. It's going to be really difficult for you to be able to throw up these charges, especially when someone has become a candidate, because you need to be very careful that you manage the allegations that might come of the agencies of government becoming partisan in this political climate that we have. But I think for all of us as a country and who are very much deeply involved in the electoral process, it is worrying the influence of money in the elections. And I think that it discourages a lot of very good persons who want to come into public office. It discourages their participation because it's not a level playing field at that stage.
So, well, you also mentioned in your response now that there seems to be no way of tracking the monies that change hands. Is that something you would recommend, so that at least we can find a way, because you talked about delicate balance now? Are you suggesting a form of tracking mechanism for monies that move around, maybe to delegate, to vote buying and all those things? Is that what you would be proposing, if we could?
Yes, I think it will be important, because again, you are going to see aspirants vie to be candidates at different levels, from the state legislative houses to the federal legislative houses to governorship and to president. And for a lot of us, what we would like to see candidates emerge because of the quality of who they are. And that's why, yes, you're right, the question of tracking the monies becomes really important, because there are candidates who are flimsy, who really have no quality to put on the table, but who believe that they have the resources to buy and pay for the delegates. That's what confuses the political environment, and that's what you see lead to the quality of those who get into office at the end of the day, because they haven't gotten there because of their quality, their education, their experience, or their concerns about public interest issues. They've gotten there simply because they've been able to pay for it. So I would advocate some mechanism that is able to track the role of money in elections, and I think that especially as we approach the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that most of these conventions and the election of candidates would happen in the period of the primaries, that there needs to be tracking of the funds, there needs to be questions asked, and indeed there needs to be some way of stopping delegates. I don't know whether you can stop them, but educating delegates about the importance of voting for the candidates who would be able to deliver on expectations.
Mr. Nwankwo, whether we track or not, you know, the conversation had been on ahead of the amendment of the new Electoral Act about the monetization of the electoral process, and the civil society was categorical in its position that this shouldn't be done. So are we surprised now that political parties are pegging expression of interest and nomination forms at 100 million and 40 million naira? And, you know, the administration would say in another breath that it is fighting corruption. Isn't this double speak? And are we surprised that the delegate system, too, there are stories flying about that you know, they're smiling to the bank? Are we surprised? And isn't it double speak on the part of the government?
Well, first of all, I think the Electoral Act doesn't get into the question about the political parties and how much they should charge for nominations or expression of interest. So in terms of the Electoral Act, I don't see a violation going on. That has been left to the parties to do. And what we have seen is, of course, the embarrassing huge sums of monies that the parties have imposed, and are quite adamant in stating that they have no apologies for it. So for me, I don't think it's a question of the Electoral Act, the vacuum there, except, of course, the vacuum that relates to tracking of expenses of aspirants. With respect to the government, I don't see, it's just really that the government has not taken the proactive step of setting up an agency that would be able, an independent agency that would be able to do this in collaboration with citizens, civil society, media, and so on. So that, for me, is where the gap is. Parties are independent of government, or are supposed to be independent of government, and when parties are imposing these huge sums, then the parties themselves needs to be held responsible for their own actions. And so for me, that's where the gap is. How do you get parties to begin to understand that participation or exclusion from participation includes huge expression of interest fees that they are charging at this time?
Right. So, I mean, this conversation is one I've looked forward to, because, yes, we've talked about 2023 and how important it is, but this is actually what decides what happens in 2023, the kinds of candidates we eventually go out to vote for. So I'd like to come down now particularly to the delegates, because you talked about educating the delegates earlier on. So yes, the delegates, the members of a party, and the general populace. I was looking at the definition of delegate. I wanted to really understand this now outside of the political space, where of course it was taken from. And it essentially says a person sent or authorized to represent others, in particular an elected representative sent to a conference. So essentially delegates are representing the interests of people, thousands, millions of people. But from what you have seen, monitoring political parties and this process, would you say that's really what happens at the convention, representation of the yearnings of the people? Is that what really happens?
Well, delegates are supposed, the delegates election, you could even define it to refer to indirect elections, except, of course, that these indirect elections is really for them to produce the candidates for the election from the parties before it goes to the direct elections, which is the general elections. You look back yesterday and the day before, in the U.S., you were having members of parties vote for candidates who represent especially the two main parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, for the midterm elections in November. And you have seen that in that case, and that's where the controversy in Nigeria about direct and indirect primaries comes in. You have seen in the U.S. Members of the party, whether it's Republican or Democratic Party, voting to produce candidates. And it kind of gives you an inkling about how the midterm elections will work out in that country. We haven't quite gotten there yet because there were conversations here about direct and indirect primaries. And it was quite clear that this country wasn't ready. INEC has called on the political parties to produce their register of members. And as we speak, we know that some of these parties that claim to have a register of members don't really have a register of members. So it means that the process now of electing delegates who are supposed to represent the constituents or their constituency in choosing who the candidate would be has now again repeated the patterns that we know, which is that a few people are put in there. And you should see the jostling going on at the different levels for people to be delegates. And like you said, it's a question whether these delegates are going there to represent the members of the party who have elected them to be delegates, or are engaged in a bazaar, or will engage in a bazaar, looking for who pays the highest. And the experience in this country with delegate selection in the primaries is that you have always had people go into the primaries for the purpose of looking for how much profit they can make from it. And that's the concern that we all have. How do we get these delegates to understand that their choices at this level of the election will determine the quality of government that comes in 2023? That's a major challenge for all of us.
Now, the worry now is we need to find a way to resolve this. I mean, we're trying to catch up with time. INEC says this is a deadline, so we're just trying to do this in a hurry. But we need to ensure that we're doing this right. And I want you to speak to this, perhaps the delegates or the people who are meant to put pressure on the delegates. By the way, is there a way to even know whether the delegates voted right at the convention? I think you can also speak to that. How should we go about this as a delegate? Perhaps speak to their conscience beyond all the, the bizarre bazaar that is going on right now. What should we be looking out for as delegates who are going there to elect candidates?
Well, like you said, it's going to be an appeal to their moral values rather than a demand that they respect those who have nominated them to go and represent them and vote for them. It comes back to the same question. How do you get everyone to understand that the decisions they make about how they vote will determine the quality of the next government? My sense of it is that there's a lot to do, and you're right, Kayode, we're at a point now where suddenly it looks like, oh my God, what has happened? We are in the primaries. And that's why the parties themselves are confused and asking INEC to postpone or extend the time. Even if INEC was to extend the time, nobody would still be ready, because suddenly it looks like this came on like that. And so for a lot of us, as we speak, some of the delegates have not even been completely chosen by the parties. So yes, we can make moral appeals. We can speak to those who are going to be delegates, and maybe a few would hear the message and be able to carry it forward. But if you see the way the delegates were chosen, you would see that the kingmakers, in quotes, in the local level and at the state level and so on, were allocated the numbers of delegates that they can produce. So it immediately tells you that if you get an allocation for the number of delegates you can produce, it means that that allocation would mean you have specific numbers of persons who owe allegiance to you and who would basically be voting based on your instructions or payments to them. And I don't know how we refine the political process to get past this, but it's a major concern. But you're right, as media, as civil society, the appeal to the moral values, if some of these delegates do have them, the appeal to their moral values comes into place. And our hope is that some of those appeals could yield even if marginal results.
Well, that hasn't changed the fact that aspirants have been going around to meet with the delegates. I believe that they still believe that, and they know that the power of, the power lies in the hands of the delegates. But regardless of how power has already been shared in terms of how many delegates have been assigned the power brokers in the states, you still find that all the aspirants, be they in PDP, especially at the presidential level, are still going around to go and meet with the delegates. Do you think that this will have any effect at all?
It will have effect because in situations where there is undecided delegates, which is what we should be targeting in terms of this education conversation. In terms of undecided delegates, their impression of the aspirants would help a lot in making up their mind on how to vote. So I think it's useful, but even if the delegates are in some pockets, it's important that the aspirants are known to them and they are able to make decisions, or even if they are making or if they've already decided, they're able to understand what that decision means from the onset. So I think it's very welcome that the aspirants are going around meeting people. It tasks them, because you don't just want to see an aspirant because they've purchased the delegates simply walk into office. So there needs to be some hard work done, and it's impressive to see the aspirants going around the country and talking to delegates. I think it's healthy for democracy.
But we've seen just how long the process was, to eventually put pen to paper with regards to the Electoral Act in terms of what the president withholding assent for quite a while. And it was over this primaries and indirect primaries issue, indirect primaries and consensus option, which he wanted included. And much later when he signed, we saw that he also had objections to Section 8412. I'm wondering, assuming, and this is just a total scenario which we are trying to paint off, assuming we didn't have those options included, do you think that the process would have been, more inclusive in terms of the appeal that aspirants will have to make to, there will not be delegates, it will be everybody voting in the political parties. Do you think that we stand a fairer chance of having candidates who are not exactly money bags emerging in this process?
What you do when it's direct primaries, which means everybody votes, is that you expand the scope of the bazaar. Unfortunately. And
is that what will happen?
Yes, and that's what worries me. When you look at elections that held in some states, you remember vote buying in the polling units and so on. That would have meant that you expand the space for all of that. I think it is good enough that you have seen the plurality of options in terms of direct and indirect primaries. Consensus is neither here nor there. That's a different conversation, because even the Constitution says you could decide if a candidate is the sole candidate for the elections, there are different prescriptions on what is made. So for me, that's neither here nor there, and I don't understand why that was even an option in the Electoral Act, because consensus does not need to become a part of the Electoral Act. Somebody withdraws, he withdraws. The big problem with direct primaries, and that's the bigger problem, is that the parties, no matter how much their claim is about their membership, have no members register. A lot of them may have carried out what they call registration of members, re-registration of members, and so on. They don't have a register. Because if you do have a register, people register to become political party members. They pay a subscription fee. If you had people announcing, or parties announcing, that they have 50 million members, and each person who is a member of the political party paid 1,000 or even 100 naira, then the parties would have more than enough money for the elections itself. You could have seen parties simply by membership drive raise billions of naira from its members preparing for the elections, rather than the situation now where some claim that the reason they're imposing such huge sums is to be able to raise campaign funding. I think one needs to be able to examine what really happened with especially the two main parties upping so high nomination fees and whether that monies will actually go into the campaigns or whether it would be something shared within the working committee of those parties.
Well, quickly in 30 seconds, I don't know if you can do it. Can you share with us what your expectations will be for the conventions of both political parties as the end of the month draws closer?
Expectations are there, yes, that the parties would respect the rules. I have my concern and doubt. I think the levels of desperation will see, perhaps in one party more than in the other, confusion arise from the nominations process in ways that actually even heat up much more the polity. But in terms of my hope, I do hope that the parties understand that Nigerians are watching and ensure that they follow their own rules. Because that's really the biggest danger, that the parties themselves would subvert their own internal democracy as the primaries progress. So my hope, my expectation is that the parties will respect their internal democracy and follow due process in finding the candidates for the various positions.
Well, Mr. Clement Nwankwo, thank you so much for coming on Sunrise Daily this morning. He is the Executive Director of Policy and Legal Advocacy Center. Thank you once again for coming on.
Thank you.
We'll take a break now and we'll be back with another perspective on this same issue. Please stay with us.